Welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading education around artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and social change. In this podcast, we are hoping to provide insightful discussions with young professionals and world-leading researchers alike. I'm your host, Manuel Brenner, and now without any further ado, let's jump right in. Hi everyone, I'm here with Armond Cohen. Thanks a lot for joining us on the ACIT Science Podcast.
Happy to be here.
Armond is co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, which you have led since the formation in 1996. So this is the beginning of a podcast miniseries with the Clean Air Task Force. So in the coming months, we will have actually several discussions about topics surrounding climate change and technology. So one dedicated episode on carbon capture and one on nuclear energy. But in this introductory episode, we want to give an overview over the work you are doing with the Clean Air Task Force, but also dive deeper in some of the overarching questions surrounding climate change. So maybe as a very broad introduction, we can just start with the question, what is the Clean Air Task Force and what do you do?
Great, thanks. So we are a nonprofit environmental advocacy and research organization based in Boston, but I think we now span from Berlin to San Francisco. We have an emerging set of projects in sub-Saharan Africa and soon be working more in India and Southeast Asia. Our focus is on cleaning up the global energy system. It sounds very modest, right? But getting the global energy system down to zero emissions effectively, somewhere around mid-century, probably not right at mid-century, but somewhere around there. And our roots really were in quite modest and specific, which was trying to get under control the emissions of U.S. coal-fired power plants. And there's a long story about that. We have been substantially successful, but that really led us to kind of look at the broader global situation and see how could we decarbonize electricity, and then how can we decarbonize fuels. So we're about 85 people around the world right now, operating mostly in the US and EU, but with an emerging footprint outside those regions. And the focus is twofold, really. One is policies that do two things. One is to put emission limits in place on global warming drivers like carbon and methane. And the other policy focus is on pushing out technologies that are zero carbon that could complement renewable energy in particular in the race towards zero. That's one bucket, which is policy. The other bucket is working directly with technology companies, investors, and large utilities, large oil and gas companies to sort of navigate their way towards a zero carbon business model. So both business and policy is our focus, and we have a variety of skill sets within the organization that span from business savvy to technology to legal regulatory structures to campaigning. So we're a bit of a mixed bag, a little bit unusual for an environmental group in that we get fairly deep into technological solutions in detail.
Yeah, so you mentioned the mixed bag. I think you're not only a mixed bag in terms of the skill set that you offer, but also in terms of the solutions you're looking at. Yeah, when we scheduled this call, the title optionality was in the air, maybe also as a title for this episode. So what does optionality mean in the context of the Clean Air Task Force and in terms of the technical solutions you are looking at?
Great. It certainly is a bumper sticker that we could employ, although it's not a very sexy one. So optionality is fairly simple and intuitive, I think, to most people, which is that more solutions are generally better than just having one solution, and probably having 7 solutions is better than 3. We have all kinds of examples around us, right? Anyone who is invested in the stock market knows that it's foolish, very, very risky and foolish to just invest in one stock. You might get very lucky and have bought Apple 30 years ago and have done quite well and have nothing else, but there are very few people who have that kind of foresight. Another example would be the coronavirus solutions and vaccines. Something like we started out with something like 200 candidate vaccines, maybe more. We're now down to about 7 or 8 globally that are being widely deployed and seem to be effective. And just inevitably, things happen, and we can't predict the future. So, the idea of optionality in the climate space is that the more solutions, the more shots on goal, if you will, that we have, the more likely we are to win. And so, as a very practical level, the global narrative around climate change to date has been, not without reason, to focus very heavily on renewable energy and energy efficiency. So these are nice solutions, and who wouldn't want to save energy? And on the renewable side, solar power and wind power have expanded dramatically, to the point where they provide something like 4 or 5% of global energy today, up from almost nothing 10, 15 years ago. So that's great progress. But optionality means that you don't just bet on that one solution. As much as we want to encourage and increase that amount probably by tenfold, we also don't want to exclude other options. We want to have other options in play. And we go into details as to why that's particularly the case. Renewables are relatively cheap as a commodity, but in terms of a system that operates 24/7, 365, to provide reliable power or reliable fuel production, they will most likely need complements to work. There are other obstacles to their scale up that I think at this point are beginning to become clear. We're trying to solve, but may not be fully solvable. So it really just gets back to basic intuition that if we have more solutions rather than fewer, we're more likely to succeed.
Yeah, maybe we can take this opportunity to go a bit more in depth in the current paradigms in the environmental movement, and why especially the focus on wind and solar, and also this idea of trying to save our way out of the climate crisis by saving energy, for example, why these, in your opinion, are kind of going to fail if these are our only solutions.
Yeah, so let's start with energy efficiency. By the way, I spent the first 12 years of my career exclusively focused on that topic, and successfully got many of the largest electric utilities in the United States to start spending billions of dollars retrofitting homes and making new buildings efficient and so forth. And that effort was not wasted. There is a discernible signal in the data that suggests that things like uh, envelope insulation for new houses, or replacing light bulbs, has had some impact on energy use. But even in the developed world, in the OECD countries, the impact has been pretty modest. And also empirically, we have now some evidence that because human behavior is not completely predictable, and because the engineering models are not always accurate, we get something like 50% of the modeled impact or reductions from energy efficiency that are then are claimed or are otherwise mathematically figured. That's good. 50% is actually pretty good. But the models that we use to model the pathways to zero carbon tend to assume 100% efficacy of those measures. And there's all kinds of reasons, including the fact that sometimes when houses are insulated, people turn up their heat, and become more comfortable, which is excellent. I mean, that's a great outcome, but it doesn't necessarily lead to 100% reduction compared to in terms of the modeled result. The other overwhelming fact on energy efficiency that I think people miss, and this is for us in the rich world in the North, is that really most of the energy use in the world is coming from the global South, from the poor world, if you will. And most of the energy in the future will, even more so. The OECD countries are shrinking their energy demand, partly due to depopulation, partly due to offshoring very energy intensive industries to Asia and other regions of the world. So the reality is that it's the global South where climate change will be won or lost. And if you look at a region like sub-Saharan Africa today, where 500 million people lack any access to electricity, most of the rest have very intermittent and low levels of access, or India, which has a very similar profile. what you find is that most of the models that assume energy efficiency also assume that India or sub-Saharan Africa never get more than a small fraction of the energy that the rich world has. So right now, if we look at the International Energy Agency's 1.5 degree scenario, for example, they'll show you that in 2040 or 2050, we assume that Asia and Southeast Asia, India, and Africa are consuming maybe a tenth or a 20th per capita the energy that we in Germany or the United States do, and that's a pretty telling assumption. To support economic growth and quality of life in those parts of the world, it's likely that they will need a substantially additional amount of energy. So conservation is not the solution for the developing world. That's not to say that they should grow inefficiently or that they should build buildings that leak, but rather that the sheer volume of increase in demand is likely to swamp any marginal gains in energy efficiency. So that's the point about efficiency, which is you can't conserve your way out of this problem. You can deflect the curve somewhat. And I think that these are worthy things to do, but to rely very substantially on that particular pathway seems risky. The other thing is that to observe there is that people who look at the long wave sort of trends in energy use on the planet, can discern that we have a steady substitution of information and energy for physical capital. So, we dematerialize our lives. I mean, think of the iPhone and how much material consumption is replaced by the hours you spend on an iPhone, or think of something like Bitcoin, which is a massive energy user. It's likely that we're going to have an increasingly digitized, energy-driven economy as service industries grow. Direct material consumption per capita probably decreases somewhat. So we're really in a century. We're probably looking at a century where energy demand is massively set to increase. So anyway, that's not to say we should be inefficient, but it's to say that we should be very careful when we blithely assert that the world could save half or three quarters of the energy it's using today without any impact. On the renewable energy side, I don't mean to suggest that the gains that have been made in wind and solar are not good. I think that most models would tell you that, and we'll get back to the fallacies of models in a minute, but at least the math would tell you that that electric systems in the world would be dominated most likely, and I mean dominated in the sense of greater than 50% of the energy supplied would be coming from wind and solar, simply because they've become so inexpensive due to mass production and learning by doing and all those things. They're inexpensive as a commodity producer of kilowatt hours. There are two challenges that we see with assuming that the past inevitably suggests that they become 100% or 90% of the future. The first has to do with the issue of seasonality. That is to say that other than around the equator, solar energy and wind energy tend to fluctuate rather dramatically by seasons. So, for example, in a state like California or in Germany, there will be a ratio of production output that can vary by a factor of 3 depending on the season that you're in. So this is what we're all familiar with, this, the saying that the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and that's true. Mostly people are thinking about daily fluctuations. But if you actually look at the curves over the course of a year, you'll see that some months and some seasons are double or triple the output in other seasons. So energy storage, which is the favored solution, could cover rather easily, actually, could cover daily fluctuations. If we had simply a diurnal pattern of fluctuation, we most likely could deal with that with batteries. The problem comes when you have multiple weeks and months of very low output. And that takes you into a totally different realm of cost and management. For example, in Europe, I think most people know in Europe this fall you had a prolonged wind drought where offshore wind and onshore wind were producing at a fact 5 or 10% of their capacity for multiple weeks. This resulted in a run on gas to replace the lost wind. By the way, just to be fair, the nuclear units in France weren't doing all that well in September and October either. They had some operational issues. So those two factors combined to increase reliance on gas, which drove up the price of energy across Europe with all kinds of political implications. The seasonality of renewable energy is a critical, absolutely critical fact about them. Now, again, no one can predict the future, so it's possible that someone could come up with a magical storage solution that costs, a 1/100th of what today's storage media cost, which is about what it would take to sort of smooth out those seasonal variations without problem. But that's a big challenge and a big risk that we're actually going to get there. In the meantime, what we have is relatively expensive fixes that would increase costs substantially if we were to say do a 100% renewable system. The second, so that's the issue of seasonality. The second issue that is important to understand is land use. And I mean, simply put, wind and solar take up a lot more space than many of the alternatives, most notably nuclear energy, but also even to utilize gas, for example, natural gas with carbon capture. The ratios are substantial. We're talking about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude in land use occupation. And, I think people often say, well, there's lots of space in the world. Can't we just use the big wide open spaces of the Midwestern US or the offshore? And that seems like we have a lot of empty space. But when you really start going down and looking at the particular countries and counties and regions, you find that actually we're quite constrained. A recent study that we did in California with the Nature Conservancy and the Environmental Defense Fund looked at the opportunities for photovoltaic solar installations in California. Now, California has 105 million acres of land available theoretically. But what we did was to subtract the areas that are taken off limits for conservation reasons. And then we took off the areas that were simply unsuitable for photovoltaic development because they were on steep slopes, or they weren't exposed in the right direction to the sun, or you couldn't assemble enough contiguous parcels. And you end up with about 5 million acres out of 105 million acres that are even theoretically developable. Now, that assumes that everyone within those 5 million acres wants to site solar energy. Now, you need about 1 million acres of that 5 million acres to achieve the result that you need. So that's 20% of the available land competing with everything else, including agriculture, recreation, human development, and so forth. So it's not to say that you can't do this, although in some cases, for example, in Germany, the Agora Energiewende, which is one of the climate advocacy organizations, put together a theoretical 100% renewable scenario and posited offshore wind development that was well over the total area that was even theoretically available offshore. So the geographic facts drive you to the conclusion that this obscure idea called power density, which seems very, very wonky and technical, is actually quite an important fact. And power density is simply the amount of kilowatt hours or thermal energy that you can get out of a square kilometer. It just so happens that nuclear actually is quite compact, again, by a factor of, 100 to maybe even 1,000 compared to some of these other sources. So this is proving to be actually a real issue. I've mentioned generation siting, but transmission that you would need to connect an entirely renewable system or even a predominantly renewable system is not something that's easily done. And listeners in Germany may be familiar with the opposition to the north-south lines. So those two factors, raise caution. And the optionality concept is simply that let's go full bore on wind and solar. Absolutely, there's a lot of headroom, but let's also have a few other options, maybe ones that are 24/7, 365 available to complement and can provide a firm base, and also things that don't take up so much space. I think we're likely to end up with a mix if we're wise. But optionality is simply another way of saying diversity or hedging your bets.
Yeah, maybe quickly connecting to, I think there's this maybe somewhat idealized vision in of to people that aren't too involved in the topic of why don't we just build a lot of solar panels in the desert or just move to remote places. And I think probably from within these solutions don't seem too realistic anymore. But can you maybe talk about why ideas like this probably won't work?
Well, I think it's just a question of scale. I mean, there are many opportunities to look at this. And in fact, my organization is looking at this. The fact that we focus on the neglected technologies doesn't mean that we also are not interested in some of the more mainstream technologies. So many people have studied the opportunity, for example, to utilize North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa and places like Namibia to expand solar development in desert areas, then either convert the electricity use it to convert water to hydrogen, and ammonia, and then ship ammonia or hydrogen to Europe, or simply, in the case of North Africa, to construct undersea cables that would pipe solar electricity into Spain and Italy, and then onward into the continent. Those are not completely crazy ideas. I mean, they do have a certain logic to them. Again, it's just a question of risk and optionality. So the first fact is back to land use. It's people think these places are uninhabited, but they're not. There's substantial human settlement within desert regions, and at a minimum there are potential land use conflicts. If you go to Namibia and ask people like, is Namibia empty? I think they would tell you no. And the second fact is, again, goes back to this question of seasonal management. And you can get a certain amount of balancing. If you're near the equator, you will have more steady sun for sure. But you also have windstorms and you also have seasons. And so there is variation. The final issue, and this is, I guess you could argue it's either optionality or maybe fragility, is think about the geopolitics of Europe relying substantially for relatively politically unstable parts of the world for energy. So we saw this with the Arab oil embargo of the early 70s. Europe's now experiencing it with Russia and gas. But, imagine that a substantial part of Europe's electricity is dependent on solar energy production and undersea cables through the Med, and political instability continues in North Africa, and someone decides to cut the cables, or decides to sabotage the installations. These are not trivial risks, and I don't mean to say that solar or wind at scale are the only risks, are the only ones with geopolitical risks. Nuclear has its own challenges, although again, there are only 7 or 8 areas of the world from which uranium is supplied. Now, there is capability to hedge that with production elsewhere, but by and large, global trade in electricity or hydrogen will multiply geopolitical risks. So again, it's not to say that it is not a good thing to be pursuing. It is a very good thing to be pursuing. But again, whether we should be putting all our eggs in that basket is another question.
Yeah, maybe we can stay here with a global perspective. So in the beginning, you mentioned that you're now also collaborating with actors in sub-Saharan Africa and in the developing world. So I think a very general question is that we are all aware that we need to tackle climate change on a global level, but there tends to be the risk of these kind of neo-colonial undercurrents when the West is kind of trying to do top-down regulations in the developing world on how much energy they can spend, for example, on and how they should develop their energy sector. So how are you approaching the collaboration with the developing world? Like, how do you think on a global level we should approach this tricky question?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing is to try to, as much as possible, not to approach it from a colonial perspective, and to replicate the top down policies of the past. Our team is all born and educated in sub-Saharan Africa and is well familiar with the local politics. And so I'm just learning from them at this point about how to navigate this challenge. The I think the first principle is that one has to really work with countries where they are and what their aspirations are, rather than what we'd like them to be. And in most cases, these countries would like to be more, for lack of a better term, modern economies, more industrialized, have a higher component of services, less commodity production, and higher on the value chain. Um, Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to the African continent as a whole is expected to be 40% of global population by the end of the century. It's a very young population; it's growing very rapidly, and they have very little energy, and it's also an increasingly urbanized um, population. So the first thing is to understand what the underlying conditions and aspirations of those areas are. I don't pretend to understand that, and part of our project there is to really just spend a year or so talking candidly to the in-region experts and leaders about what their aspirations are. The discourse so far has been dominated by Northern multilateral financial institutions, governments. Germany's been particularly active in that region of Africa in particular, and as well as NGOs. And the dominant narrative is something like this: yes, it's true. Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have a lot of energy, but we can supply it with, solar panels in remote villages with battery backup, and at least we can start getting them up the energy ladder. And there's nothing wrong with that as a first step. But again, most of Africa's population will be urban after mid-century, maybe as much as 70% by the end of the century. And so rural electrification may be a first step, but it is not the basis to build an industrial advanced economy, which is what we think. What we're hearing from those regions is what people are desiring. Now, that said, again, both things can be true. It can be true that in order to provide basic access to light and cell phone charging, and refrigeration of vaccines and so forth, that having decentralized, low cost energy like solar might be a valuable thing to do. At the same time, there's a recent study in Kenya that showed that most Kenyans were actually within a mile or two of a high voltage transmission line. So it's not necessarily the case that we have to think of rural Africa as being solely dependent on decentralized small scale power production, which, by the way, is very expensive. These are very expensive. Uh, these are very, very expensive energy sources. Maybe a factor of 4 or 5 more expensive than grid power. That said, it's not trivial to extend grid power into rural regions, or that last 1 or 2 miles. That's not a trivial exercise. And it's also keeping the grid itself reliably powered is not a trivial exercise. So again, I think the question here is not so much what is the specific solution, but what is the process by which you arrive at that solution. And I think the argument or the premise of our project is we really need and to work with people in the region to understand what they think the development patterns are likely to be, what their aspirations are, and then what kind of energy system they'd like to evolve to meet those aspirations. So we actually don't expect necessarily to have a high profile in those regions. A lot of the ways that Clean Air Task Force works um, is essentially to catalyze networks of people. We bring information to the table. We do convening, but we don't see ourselves as necessarily leading efforts. We see ourselves as identifying opportunities. And in region, Africa has plenty of well educated electrical engineers, system planners, and technology experts. And we actually think that Africa could be a leader in many of the advanced technologies. For example, deep, super hot geothermal, where there's a lot of opportunity in Africa, particularly the Kenyan Rift Valley, could be an innovation hub for the world on that technology. So anyway, that's a short way, I should say a long way of expressing an idea, which is that the West should seek to understand first before acting. And what we see largely going on right now is Western institutions cookie cutting their preferred solutions and grafting them into sub-Saharan Africa or India. And if you talk to people on the ground in those countries who are involved in these activities, what they'll say is something like, yes, we know this is not a complete solution, and we know that it may not be compatible fully with our vision, but these are the people with the money, so we will tell them what they want to hear, and we will implement the solutions they want us to implement. But that's not scalable ultimately, because these are relatively expensive solutions, and at some point, the societies are going to want to move to the next stage of development, and it's likely that will be the case. The recent COP26 in Glasgow revealed some interesting fissures where you began to see African voices come forward and say, that what the vision that the West has as Africa may not be the right vision. And in fact, they're raising the question of whether there should be some additional room for natural gas utilization in sub-Saharan Africa to get to sort of some minimal level of stable electricity production, which of course is something that Germany and others, completely abhor. And the Africans are pointing out that, well, if we brought a lot of natural gas in to or use some of our natural gas to provide electricity, the impact on global emissions, given how low our consumptions level are, would be in the noise. And maybe that's a development stage that we have to go through, just as the West went through it 200 years ago. And we can transition, but we can't do it immediately. So anyway, we're beginning to see a little bit of a balance in the discourse, a little shift.
Yeah, I would love to linger here, but maybe in the interest of time, we can take a step back again and discuss more generally what's been happening around the climate change movement as an identity movement. And there seems to have been this big perceptual shift in all over Europe with the youth movements and the climate strikes and all of this around climate change. So you've been doing this for 25 years. So has there been like a significant shift in how everything is going in the last 2 or 3 years, maybe?
Yeah, I think there's been a dramatic shift. And I think it's not just in the youth movements, but I think it's in the financial sector, the utility sector, the government sector. I have been doing this work for actually more than 25 years, 30 or more. And, it was very slow at first, I think, to get recognition of this issue. But I think recently Carbon Tracker uh, uh, documented that something like 90% of the world's countries have made some kind of net zero commitment. Now, of varying degrees of rigor, but some of it's rhetoric, but some of it's in law. But nonetheless, that's a pretty substantial movement. In the United States, 50% of electricity is now being delivered in jurisdictions or in utility service territories with a net zero commitment. So I think the question of not whether we're going to deal with this problem, but when we're going to deal with this problem has become the issue, and exactly how. So the positive news is that there does seem to be at least at the level of what makes the news, which is largely in the rich world, a recognition of the importance of this issue, and in the developing world as well, that climate is in danger and is something that we need to attend to. That's the good news. The downside, well, actually, I would say that there's on the downside there is, I think, somewhat of a tendency to oversimplify the solution pathway, and we see that with people like Greta Thunberg saying, well, it's a massive climate crisis, but anything other than solar and wind is a false solution. That's the new term of art in quotes. It's a false solution. I want to question these people and say, in what respect is it false? Do you mean it technically doesn't work, or that we don't have demonstrations of these technologies, or that somehow it diverts attention from a much better solution? I'll be specific. And I think that is, again, that's fragile thinking, or anti-optional thinking. It's monolithic thinking. I don't know Greta Thunberg. I suspect she's being advised by people who have an agenda around these issues, and these are complicated issues that go back. We could have a whole session about the origins of the modern environmental movement in Germany and other places, and unfortunately, in some ways, that movement was linked to nuclear power and nuclear weapons fear, and nuclear has a very substantial stigma associated with it in certain quarters of the world. On the other hand, what we're seeing in most regions of the world is that, by and large, the public favors nuclear energy by a factor of 2 to 1, but there is a determined minority that opposes it, and opposes it maybe not necessarily for reasons of efficacy or efficiency, or that it's necessarily not a good climate solution in an engineering sense, but that they object to the social implications of it, and that's a whole other set of issues. It's not a monolithic movement. You have young people saying, I don't care what we need to solve this. We just need to solve the problem. Let's get on with it. And we're willing to consider all technologies. Paradoxically, it tends to be older people who are more like my age, who tend to be a bit more perhaps discriminating in their view of this, and say, well, it is an emergency, but I really only accept a certain limited number of solutions, which if you push it logically, really means I hate this solution more than I hate climate change. It's very hard to have that discussion openly because and in a rigorous way, because there's a lot of rhetoric and ideology around this. Our organization just takes the position that everything has drawbacks, everything has benefits. There's no such thing as a completely clean energy source, whether you're talking about minerals, mining, or impacts on ecosystems, or impacts on scenic areas or conservation, or economics. You need to look at all of these as potentially complementary sources. So again, to summarize, there has been a sea change in views on climate, but I think that the implementation is now going to be more challenging as we actually get down to what do we do to solve this problem. Believe me, if I thought that just citing wind and solar plants was the answer, that's the only thing I'd be working on. But I don't. The evidence that we see is that those are good partial solutions, but that they are not likely to be complete. So it's again a mixed bag. Some pluses and minuses in the recent level of energy around these topics. But if we can keep focused on the goal, which is eliminating emissions in the most efficient and affordable way possible, without collateral damage, we'll be much better off.
Yeah, maybe lingering on this point of the whole social angle on the climate movement. So in his book Apocalypse Never, Michael Schellenberger criticizes a somewhat pessimistic apocalyptic outlook in the climate movement, especially among the young generation, and that almost seems to inhibit action in some way and kind of focus on these more dogmatic approaches and kind of blinding us to some solutions. I don't know if you know this book or what you think of him, but maybe connecting this to your mentality in the Clean Air Task Force, what do you think a useful mentality when tackling climate change is, and how you kind of balance this panic versus pragmatic optimism, and actually this hope that we can actually tackle climate change still.
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't read the book, and I'm familiar with Schellenberger's arguments, though, in general. I think there's a grain of truth in that. The youth movement is not entirely pessimistic or apocalyptic. I know of many young people who are very interested in solving the problem, who take a very measured and I would say even almost engineering approach to the topic. One of the best books on nuclear energy. Is by a writer named Stefan Quist, who I think is still in his 20s. And Stefan has written a nice book about nuclear energy. It's not by any means a book claiming that nuclear can solve all of our problems, but it does quite analytically lay out the steps forward. There's a millennial writer in the United States named Solomon Goldstein Rose, who's written a nice book for people his age that is called The 100% Solution, which talks about multiple technologies. So it's not as if the entire youth movement is apocalyptic or single-minded in its solution set. I do think that the danger we have in the culture we live in right now of instant everything, and the sort of the blogosphere, the Twittersphere, where arguments are very hard to unpack. It's very difficult to explain anything complicated, and there's a lot of shouting and slogans to really sort of think about this problem in a sort of measured way. The way I like to think about it is that it took the planet 200 years to get into this problem. It's not going to be solved in 10 years. The world's not going to disappear in 12 years, as some politicians have said. If we don't get to zero, the energy systems have a lot of inertia built in. But I do think that there is a need to bring together the energy of the youth movement with the complexity of the problem, without dampening the enthusiasm for solving it, but to harness that energy and have more young people starting to work on multiple solution pathways, and frankly changing attitudes around things like nuclear energy. Again, I don't, nuclear is just one example. I mean, there are many other things that we work on, like deep superhot geothermal or carbon capture to produce hydrogen. But what really has to happen is for that as those activists get older, or maybe before they get too much older, to really connect them with kind of the systems thinking, which is what's critical to solve this problem. The energy system is an incredibly complicated machine. The National Academies of Engineering were asked to recently, a few years ago, identify the greatest technological achievement of the 20th century, and what they said was the power grid, which is actually multiple things, right? It's a system, but the point is that modern life is really unimaginable without an electric power grid. And so, but the thousands upon thousands of machines that go into making that work, and systems and controls that go into making that work, unfortunately, it's 80% fueled by fossil energy today. To transform that in a period of decades to a zero carbon system while maintaining reliability and affordability it's not something that you work out on Twitter. And I think that will be the challenge. I think this, in some ways, it's mental overload for a lot of people. And I don't mean to suggest these issues are only to be left to the experts, the deep experts, but we do need to enrich the conversation a bit. And actually, CATF is working on how we can actually find youth leaders to get them a little bit more plugged in to the solution space, and the complexities of the solution space, and the fact that they need to be, or suggesting that they need to be really kind of spending some time understanding these issues, and not just accepting, whatever the popular position is on the topic.
Yeah, and once technological solutions become clear, there's still this next step to actually get them into politics. So I heard you mention in a different context that policy actually trumps economy in the energy sector, and that regulatory change can really drive innovation in the energy sector much more than really an economical perspective. So
Yeah, I think that's that statement probably without the other sentence, which is that there's a relationship between policy and economy. So
yeah,
the first part of the sentence or the first part of the paragraph is true that if we look at the development of wind and solar and why it's become so inexpensive, it's almost entirely a policy driven fact, and that is that governments started mandating the acquisition of this technology or the deployment of this technology initially at very, very high cost. So, Germany, for example, in the US, created a huge demand for by so-called feed-in tariffs or subsidies for these technologies. And in the United States, we simply mandated that X percentage of power had to be provided by these sources. That created a huge global demand for the kit. And frankly, basically, China stepped in and said, we'll supply that. And we learned a lot more when you deploy at scale. Inevitably, you go down a learning curve, both in manufacturing and in deployment. So in that sense, policy, or if we look at nuclear energy in the 1970s, entirely the scale up was entirely a function of government policy. It's a technology that, like solar and wind, was not competitive against fossil fuels, but was thought to have other attributes that were valuable, and so governments leaned very heavily on policies to promote them. So in that sense, policy, drives Trump's economy. On the other hand, there is a limit to that, and there's a point at which a certain level of deployment of a technology, if it's deployed too fast or before it runs down the cost curve, can be, or has other knock-on effects, can actually end the sort of terminate the policy, if you will. So, for example, I think what we're seeing I'm guessing that what will happen in Western Europe as a result of the as we get more and more deployment of renewable energy, and we see that that you have events like this fall where wind was quite low in availability, which resulted in increased costs to the system. It wasn't the only driver, but it was one of the drivers. You will see the beginning of a certain amount of putting of the foot on the brakes as we explore other options. So I think that I don't think the world is ready to spend 3 times on energy what it spends today, and I think particularly the developing world is not keen to do that. So there is a balance there, but and it's actually when it's well done, it can be a virtuous circle in which politics drives innovation and deployment. And in turn, as deployment drives costs down, it becomes possible to drive the politics further. So, for example, there's no question that it has been easier, not easy, but easier to mandate these zero carbon or zero emissions trajectories because wind and solar have come down in cost. I mean,
yeah,
that's just a fact. That if governments thought it was going to cost 3 or 4 times, current energy prices to solve this problem, they wouldn't have touched those
yeah.
pledges. But there is evidence that we do have lowering costs for alternative energy, and so that's a good thing. And so policy trumps economy, and then ultimately economy can, as we get economic gains from policy, we can drive policy. But this is the problem of moving too fast. Is that if we get ahead of the economics too far, there will be a backlash.
Yeah, so I think another issue is that both within countries, especially in the US and on a global level, there's increasing tribalism, and considering climate change is a social movement now, that it's also caught up in all this tribal energy. So you mentioned that you are trying to achieve these kind of bipartisan solutions and have had some progress in the US Congress as well.
Yeah, I think that it is an unfortunate area, and I mean, it's energy does not exist apart. I mean, it is I think it is a uniquely connected issue to other social factors, and we could get into the neuropsychology of that and the social psychology of that. It would take many hours to discuss, but um, the uh, the U.S. has, I think, taken some good steps forward. I testified before the United States Senate last week, and we had Democrats and Republicans both agreeing on something. They agree on very, very, very little, but the agreement in the meeting was that we really need to be deploying all of our zero carbon energy sources, and in part for the Republicans, that was in part the hearing happened to be on nuclear energy, but the Republicans understand that deployment of low carbon technology is a good thing economically when it can be made cheap, and the Democrats, of course, are very interested in solving climate. So each, for their own reasons, are embracing a very technology forward approach. I think the politics, oddly enough, have gotten better on the energy issue in the United States from a bipartisan perspective, even as it's gotten much worse on everything else. It's like the one bright spot that we're actually seeing. There aren't really many outright Republican climate deniers anymore. The rhetoric has shifted more to, well, yeah, it might be a problem, but we don't have the solutions today, or whatever. But um, so I am optimistic actually about this. It has been tribal, to some extent. There is I will just confess that I started my career as an anti-nuclear lawyer. So just as a little known fact about me, which is that my very first case as a lawyer was trying to stop a nuclear power plant in New Hampshire in the United States from being financed. This I was definitely part of a social movement. I was raised in the 1970s, and nuclear energy was seen to be a part of the established order that was to be mistrusted because of its misconduct of the Vietnam War, its suppression of domestic dissent, and so forth. So a lot of people my age, I'm now in my mid 60s, who grew up in that atmosphere, and I think this is true from what I understand in Germany too, associated nuclear energy with a sort of society that they didn't want to live in, or that they felt had some fundamental flaws. That was then. I'm not going to excuse or explain my behavior, but you get older and you understand that these things are complicated, and so I think what we're seeing now on the left, I'll call it broadly speaking, the left, or the pro climate movement, is an appreciation of the scale of the problem, the difficulty of achieving scale within a few decades, the benefits of things like nuclear or carbon capture, as well as appreciating they have their own fragilities, and also the limits of everything else. So I am actually quite optimistic that this conversation can unfold over time, and people will mature in their views on this. But we can't predict. We can't predict. I think we're going to have a lot of failures first before people come around on this. And I've been interested to see how the carbon capture debate is proceeding in Europe, and particularly in Germany, where I think initially there was a thought that there's carbon capture is a completely taboo technology to think about under any circumstances. And now you're beginning to see the discourse within government and even within the NGO community of, well, for industrial sources that are hard to control, maybe that's a partial solution at least. And so there's a bit of a recognition of the engineering facts and reality. I think the challenge with climate, as with any major issue in the world today, is can you center the debate around a common factual base, or at least a common, or even an agreement that facts matter, which is really the first step, right? Are we coming from a place of analysis and data, or are we entirely ideological? And once you get once you get past that hurdle, then the next question is, what are the uncertainties? What is the value of options? What are the social tolerances? What are the trade-offs between economics and social values? For example, do I want solar panels all over my neighborhood? Well, I'm willing to accept that personally. I don't have any problem with it. And maybe, we need to change in social attitude on some of these things, but uh, that's to be determined. So I think, it's we're in a pretty dark moment in history right now. I think it would be fair to say, and in terms of brain versus brain stem, and I think that my hope is that the climate crisis, if you will, if we think about it in non-apocalyptic terms, that is to say, the world's not going to end tomorrow. It's not going to end in 20 years. It's not going to end in 50 years. But there is some very serious danger here, that we can move forward. If we can move forward in a sort of stepwise fashion. Imagine if in the pandemic we had actually been prepared and had said, "There's a pandemic coming, and we can start on vaccines, and we can start on a global supply chain and a logistical system and an early warning system." Imagine if we had done that, as Bill Gates suggested we do 5 years ago. The world would look very different in 2022 than it does right now with the pandemic. So I think those are good examples of where, if we lay the groundwork and take the actions we need to, and create the 200 vaccines instead of relying on one that might succeed or fail. I think we have a serious chance at solving this problem. Maybe not in 20 or 30 years, but certainly over a period of decades. So that's a vote for rationality, which is not all that popular these days. But I'll stick to it.
Yeah, I wanted to connect this to I think there's this general sense among a lot of people that they want to get active when it comes to climate change, but don't really know where to start, what to tackle. So according to the Effective Altruism Foundation, the Clean Air Task Force is one of the top 3 most cost-effective international organizations battling climate change. So maybe as a general question, why do you think you managed to be so effective, and what effect has that effective altruism endorsement had for you?
Right. Well, I think in terms of our effectiveness, it's a willing. This is going to sound like an advertisement, but I'll say it anyway. I think the 2 attributes that have led to our effectiveness are, one, the willingness to go back and look at fundamentals, first principles around what is necessary, what would be the successful elements of a climate solution. And the first principles are fundamentally: does it work physically? Second, can it scale? And third, is it achievable within the political and economic framework? And those are principles which are pretty enduring, and they've led, I think, to some pretty effective strategies in terms of deployment. We also do a fair amount of work on the regulatory side. I've spoken a lot about in this podcast about work on the technology side, but we also have lawyers and activists and campaigners who push for carbon limits and methane limits and so forth. So I think it's our ability, first and foremost, to go back to first principles and say what will work, that drives the strategy, and then a willingness to use whatever tool is necessary to achieve the results. So it could be a grassroots campaign that we fund or help get funded. It could be running around Europe with infrared cameras showing methane leaks. It could be going into developing a 150-page, detailed white paper on blue hydrogen in Europe, or whatever. But so it's the ability to think clearly about the problem at scale, and then to take the appropriate tactic, I guess you could say, to implement the objective. So that's, I think there are people who recognized our impact as changing the dialogue and the frame. The effective altruism movement has had a very substantial impact on us in the sense that in 2 ways. One is, I think that in terms of money, frankly, we were a very small organization as little as 2 years ago, and we've tripled our size as a result of effective altruism, understanding our approach and developing uh, the um, uh, the bottom line is that that we have seen increased donations from the effective altruism sector, due in part to a very excellent report, or I should say, very favorable report. Other people can judge whether it was excellent, but we get a very extensive analysis of our impact and our operations was done by the Founders Pledge, which is a UK based platform. You can go online and see the analysis there. And the Founders Pledge recommended us as one of two major global charities to give to curb climate change. That then went viral, so to speak, and as a result, other effective altruism platforms recognized us and rounded up donors to provide support to us. And that's really allowed us to expand our operations and our approach considerably in terms of additional research, additional staffing, expansion of global footprint. We were mostly a U.S. based organization, but it was really effective altruism that boosted us into Europe, where we now have an office in Brussels, which I think is something like a dozen people, into sub-Saharan Africa, and then impending development and expansion into Southeast Asia and the like. The That's been one impact. The other impact is simply that I think the recognition itself is important because in some ways, validation of our ideas is not only among the experts but among the, let's say, the reading public. So when we've gotten validation in places like the New York Times and Atlantic Magazine or in European publications, and our name comes up, it inevitably provides validation of our point of view. And while that you may argue that's not entirely fair, that people should be judged by the details. The fact is, we've gotten a lot of endorsements, and that means that we're more credible in the political space. So, effective altruism is actually a very big driver, I think, globally right now of philanthropy. But also, these are also people, by and large, who are influential in their own spheres. They sit in the center of decision-making networks. Many of them are connected to government, to finance, to media. And so I think what we've experienced is maybe an increased acceptance and legitimation of our points of view. So that's been the impact, and it's been a very interesting world to navigate. I think by and large, effective altruism has been a welcome innovation in the philanthropic space, because they do their homework. They try and judge effectiveness. They don't just give money to their friends and the friends of friends, which is really a lot of traditional philanthropy, is just people they're comfortable with. But what we found with effective altruism is most of these people are that we deal with in that world are they have some kind of technical training. They're successful business people from finance or IT, or they're academics, or people who just have learned to, think pretty rigorously about things in their disciplines. And we find that that's a much better kind of supporter to have, because they understand not only the substance of what we do, but that it actually needs multiple years support, that you can't just throw money at a problem and expect it to be solved in a year. So it's had a huge impact on us, and I think on other organizations in the field that have lacked funding for many years because they didn't have a great brand name. But effective altruism, I think, has been very effective in seeking out effective organizations and then trying to provide them with the kind of long range support they need.
Are there any big changes within the Clean Air Task Force that are now allowed through that explosion in funding through private donors?
Well, just most notably, we've been able to hire talent that we weren't able to hire before. Really great, deep experts in technology and energy systems. Many people from industry. Frankly, some people have come from the oil and gas industry, but want to have great experience in the energy sector, but have wanted to work on zero carbon energy. We have had the ability to increase our communications, to become much more effective at that. and as well as our sister organization, which is called Clean Air Task Force Action, at least in the United States, has become able to become more active politically, and actually provide support to uh, elected officials who are doing the right thing and are approaching, sensible policies. So, just without question, staff, the ability to do more research, the ability to innovate more rapidly, and then the ability to just hire up and spread geographically. All of those things would not have been possible without effective altruism.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Maybe to come to an end now, I like to ask a kind of as a meta question in the end. Do you have any favorite book or like article that inspired you recently? I think judging from your background, you enjoy books. So
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I was so I just this weekend, in fact, finished Neil Ferguson's book Doom, which sounds like a cheery title, but it's an excellent book. Which is he's one of these big picture
yeah,
historians who looks at long wave trends, and the thrust of the book is really, I mean, it's actually quite related to what we were talking about this morning. The that generally speaking, how civilization manages crises like pandemics or uh, earthquakes, or nuclear threats, uh, all of it's all about how good the social networks are and how resilient they are. Um, Bad things happen, but really it's a question of how you recover and manage, and it's all about governance and social networks and how robust they are. And so it's a sprawling book, but and it's I there are parts of it that I don't necessarily know that I need to have 5 pages on the microbiology of viruses, but I think it's one of his big picture books, and I think it captures nicely the idea that these large problems are managed best through quite methodical and resilient network building. And I think that's, I didn't read it. Actually, I was reading it for an entirely different purpose, which is that a friend recommended it. I didn't think it was going to relate to my day job, but it did. Um, the other book I would say that influenced me greatly, and it's the subject of a talk I gave a few years ago, is by a philosopher named Isaiah Berlin,
yeah,
who's long since died. But he has a wonderful essay called "The Hedgehog and the Fox," and he talks about two different kinds of thinking: the hedgehog that only knows one thing, and the fox that knows many things. And it's really a defense of pluralism of thinking. And the essay is actually more about literature; it's not about politics. But I've often thought about that essay as a kind of a difference in temperament, in approach to problems. And I think, I gave a lecture a couple years ago about how, if we're going to solve climate change, we need to be foxes, not hedgehogs. And I think that everything that I've seen has confirmed that point of view. But then maybe that's my own confirmation bias working.
yeah,
So who knows? But Ferguson's interesting. He takes the long wave
yeah,
view, and his comment on climate change is actually that he's concerned that there is you see around pandemics and other big social upheavals of the past couple thousand years, this tendency towards millenarianism or end of world thinking, and that generally doesn't help too much,
yeah,
because it tends to lead to the identification of villains and this notion that if we can just get rid of the villains, and destroy them, then all will be well, and that's not conducive to to an effective approach. So anyway, that's, for what it's worth, a very very unattractive title, but
yeah.
nonetheless a pretty interesting book.
It connects nicely to what you said about too much brainstem and not enough cortex. I think that's probably going to be the deciding factor for the next couple of decades.
I think
Yeah.
so. I think so.
Okay.
All
I
right.
think this is a great way to end it. So thanks a lot for taking the time and for your work and these great insights.
Excellent. And Manuel, you keep up the good work. Your blogs are fascinating, and I
Very
hope
happy to
that
hear that.
people, I hope that you continue your good work in this area. All right, take care, and my best to your listeners.
Take care.